Hello guys, and now we are on the second game in the Blockades and Prophylaxis series, and this game was played between Smyslow and Denker in Moscow 1946, and this game is a Sicilian opening, and let's see how the game goes. Now e4, c5, and knight c3, knight c6, g3, g6, and bishop g2, bishop g7, then d3, e6. Now knight, bishop e3, then knight to d4. Here d6 is more common. Now knight c e2. This is an interesting move. White wants to play c3 and later on d4. This is why black should jump to d4 only after knight knight on g1 comes to e2, and now d6. Here if knight takes e2, then knight takes e2, then bishop takes b2, rook to b1. White wins back the pawn. Now a big mistake would be queen to a5 check. Now bishop to d2, queen to, now after bishop d2, queen takes a2 and rook takes b2, queen takes b2. Now bishop to c3 is coming, so queen a5 check is a blunder. Now so knight takes e2 is not good. So after knight c e2, then d6, then c3. Now knight c6. Even now knight takes e2, knight takes e2, knight to e7, d4, queen to c7 is also okay for black. Now after knight c6, then d4, then cd4, then knight takes d4. White had this recapture in mind since his 7th move. The point is that black's pawn structure, that is d6, e6 and g6, is fairly weak. Black's dark squared bishop cannot simultaneously be fianchettoed and protect the d6 pawn. Now if at all c takes d4 would give black many solid options like d5. Like d5 or knight g2 e7, or even queen a5 check, then knight to c3, knight f6. Now so it is better to take with the knight on d4. Now after knight takes d4, bishop takes d4, e5, and here white plays bishop to e3. Here if instead of e5, if knight to f6, then white plays e5. Now after d5, then bishop takes e5, queen takes d1, rook takes d1, and here white poses another kind of problem to black. The queen side is paralyzed. Here if tall bishop takes d4, then queen takes d4, now e5, then queen to a4 check, now bishop d7, queen to a3, queen to b6 is relatively okay for black, although white should be somewhat better. After e5, bishop e3, then knight to e7. Here knight f6 is also better. After knight f6, then knight to e2, bishop to e6, then short castles, and here d5, ed5, bishop takes d5, then queen a4 check, queen d7, queen takes, then king takes, then rook a d1, or even rook f d1. And after bishop takes d5, if at all knight takes d5, then bishop c5. After bishop e6 and castles by white, even black black can castle, it is okay for black. But here actually black played knight knight e7, and now knight to e2, now castles and bishop e6, then queen d2, queen c7. If at all d5 is played, then bishop to c5 comes. Now rook f c1 with the idea to play c4, and f5 now. Here b5 could have been risky in view of a4 and a6. Now rook to d1, and black is in trouble. Black hopes to advance the d pawn after eliminating the e4 pawn. I mean not on this move, after pushing the f5 by black. Here if b takes a4, then rook takes a4, then a5, rook c a1, and preparing b4. So but black plays f5, and he hopes to advance the d pawn after eliminating the e4 pawn. But c4, now fe4, now knight c3, then knight f5. If at all bishop takes c4, then knight takes e4, then d5, then knight to c5 with big problems for black. So black played knight f5, Now knight takes e4. Now with the threat of knight g5, knight takes e3. Knight takes e3 and queen takes e3. If at all knight d4, then c5, d5, knight to g5, bishop to f7, and knight takes f7, queen takes now f4 with a strong initiative for white. So after knight takes e3, queen takes e3, f takes e3 is bad because black gets counterplay after bishop to h6. After queen takes e3, h6, white has harmoniously placed his pieces, and now is the time to fight for the d5 square. Black's bishop pair is useless, especially the dark squared bishop. Now rook d1, now rook f to d8. Now rook a c1, rook a c8, b3, b6, then knight to c3. The white pieces are optimally placed and it is time to find the correct plan. Certainly the d5 square should be occupied. Doing so with the knight could give black a chance to play with opposite colored bishops. White would still be better, but black may have chances to survive. Black's bishop on e6 is his most valuable piece, so white should exchange it. The white knight will dominate over the bad bishop on g7. The strong blockading squares d5 and e4 will be occupied by the white pieces. Now queen to e7. Here if king h7, then bishop to e4 with the idea of advancing the h pawn gives white a very strong attack. So after queen e7, now bishop to d5, king h7, bishop takes e6, queen takes e6, then rook d3, rook c7, rook cd1, rook f7, now knight to e4. The d6 pawn is black's main weakness, so the knight belongs on e4. Here instead knight d5 doesn't give white anything. Why block the d5? The pawn should be conquered. Now bishop to f8 and rook d5. Preparing to triple on the d5. The queen goes behind the rooks. The main goal has been achieved. A firm blockade. Black's central pawns are fixed targets which paralyze the pieces behind them. Now queen g4. Rook 1 to d3. Here if knight takes d6, then bishop takes d6, rook takes d6, and queen takes d1 check, rook takes d1, and rook takes d1 with excellent drawing chances. So after queen g3, queen g4, rook 1 to d3, then bishop to e7. Here if at all queen to e6, then queen to d2, then rook f d7, then c5. If it is taken, then knight takes c5 is coming. After bishop e7, now knight takes d6. The pawn is lost. A triumph of logic and pure strategy. Bishop takes d6, rook takes d6, rook d f8. Now queen takes e5. White precisely calculated that the f-file would bring nothing to black. After rook takes f2, now rook d7 check. Now rook 8 f7. Now rook takes f7, rook takes f7. Then rook to d8. Now rook g7. Now queen e8. The game is over. The next stage is a convincing Smith-Low realization. Now g5, queen h8 check, king g6, and rook d6 check, king f7, then queen takes h6. Even queen a8 is also winning here. Now queen f5, then rook d1, queen c5 check, king g2, queen e7, then rook f1, king g8, queen f6, queen e8, queen f5, g4, rook f2, queen e7, queen d3. Now rook to g5, rook to g5, then rook e2, now queen f8, queen e4, rook g7, queen d5 check, queen f7, rook to e6. And finally black resigned here. Okay guys, I hope you would have enjoyed the game. I'll be meeting you in the next game. Thank you all.